All right, strap yourselves in, because on today's deep dive, we're tackling the Cannonball Run, the real one, not the movies. We're talking a totally illegal cross-country race, where the only rule was get from New York to Redondo Beach, California, faster than anybody else.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating look at America in the 70s. We'll be exploring the races themselves, but also the context, the fuel crisis, how people felt about speed limits, that sense of rebellion. That kind of fueled this whole thing.
And for this deep dive, you've brought us some incredible stuff, articles, firsthand accounts, even some behind-the-scenes stories. So our mission today is to break down the Cannonball's golden era, from 1971 to 1979. We'll look at how it all started, who the major players were, and the legacy it left.
And what a legacy. The Cannonball Run wasn't just a race. It was a cultural phenomenon. Spawn movies, spin-off races, and people are still trying to break records to this day.
Okay, so let's unpack this. For those who only know the Cannonball Run from the movies, can you give us a quick rundown of what the actual race was all about?
Officially, it was called the Cannonball Baker Sea to Shining Sea Memorial Trophy Dash. But most people just called it the Cannonball. It was unsanctioned, completely illegal, no set route, no official checkpoints, and definitely no speed limits.
So basically, a real-life Fast and Furious before Fast and Curious was even a thing.
Pretty much anything went, as long as you made it from New York to California the fastest. And it wasn't just cars either. Motorcycles, vans, even an ambulance at one point. If it had wheels and an engine, it was eligible.
An ambulance. I want to hear more about that one. But first, let's rewind to the beginning. How did this crazy race even get started? Who was the mastermind?
That would be Brock Yates, well-known automotive journalist, racing enthusiast. He envisioned the Cannonball as a way to protest what he saw as increasingly restrictive traffic laws, particularly the newly imposed 55-mile-per-hour national speed limit.
So it started as a statement, a rebellion against the establishment.
Exactly. Yates saw it as a celebration of individual freedom and a way to test the limits of man and machine. And what better way to do that than to race across the whole country as fast as possible?
Talk about making a statement. So walk us through that first Cannonball in 1971. What was it like?
Well, the first one was more of a reconnaissance run. Yates and his son entered a Dodge van. Not exactly your typical racing vehicle. They wanted to map out the route and get a sense of what it would take to win.
A Dodge van. I'm picturing shag carpet and wood paneling.
You're not far off. But it was the second race later that year that really put the Cannonball on the map. Yates teamed up with legendary race car driver Dan Gurney, and they entered a Ferrari 365 Daytona.
Now that's how you make an entrance. A Ferrari Daytona in a coast-to-coast outlaw race. What happened? Did they win?
They dominated, completed the run a little over 35 hours, averaging a speed of 80 miles per hour. Remember, this was when the national speed limit was 55. It sent shockwaves through the automotive world and made it clear that the Cannonball was more than just a publicity stunt. It was a serious test of skill and endurance.
I bet that got people's attention. 80 mile per hour average across the country. Back in 71. That's incredible. So the Cannonball was born. It was off to the races. What happened in the following years? Did it keep growing?
It absolutely exploded in popularity. Each race drew a more diverse and colorful cast of characters. Professional racers, amateur enthusiasts, celebrities, even a couple of guys who entered in a souped-up ambulance.
Wait, what? An ambulance? I have so many questions about that one.
We'll definitely get to that story. It's a classic. But for now, let's stick with the early years. In 1972, a Cadillac DeVille, driven by a team of auto executives, actually won the race.
The Cadillac. You wouldn't exactly picture a Cadillac as the ideal Cannonball car.
Right. It goes to show that the Cannonball wasn't just about raw speed. It was also about strategy, cunning.
This is where it gets really interesting. What about the tactics and technology? I mean, this was an illegal race. They had to have some tricks up their sleeves to avoid getting caught.
Oh, they had plenty of tricks. CB radios were essential for communication between teams and for monitoring police chatter.
So they were basically using the CB to create their own intelligence network on the road.
Exactly. They also used radar detectors, police scanners, and even some more, shall we say, creative methods for avoiding unwanted attention.
Like what? Spill the beans?
Let's just say that some teams got very good at disguising their vehicles, blending in with traffic, and even using decoys to throw off the police. And remember, this was before GPS and cell phones, so navigation was a lot more challenging. They relied on paper maps, compasses, and good old-fashioned intuition.
Sounds like a combination of high-stakes driving and a real-life game of cat and mouse with the authorities.
It absolutely was. But despite all the risks and the inherent danger of driving at high speeds, There were remarkably few accidents during the official Cannonball runs.
Really? That's surprising. You'd think with all that speed and adrenaline,
Hmm.
there would be more crashes.
You would. But these guys were incredibly skilled drivers. Most of them had professional racing experience. And they took safety seriously, at least as seriously as you can when you're breaking the law by racing across the country at 100 miles per hour.
All right, let's talk about one of those skilled drivers. This next story is straight out of a Hollywood movie. One of the most iconic images associated with the Cannonball Run. It's that black Lamborghini Countach, right?
Oh, absolutely. That Countach. Driven by stuntman Hal Needham, with Brock Yates himself as co-driver, has become a symbol of the Cannonball. It perfectly embodies the spirit of the race, speed, style, and a healthy dose of rebellion. But that wasn't the first time that a Cannonball car ended up on the big screen, was it? You're right, it wasn't. Remember the ambulance story from earlier? That souped-up Chevy van was driven by Brock Yates and Hal Needham in the 1979 Cannonball, and then actually appeared in the Cannonball Run movie. Talk about blurring the lines between reality and fiction.
That's wild. It seems like the Cannonball Run and Hollywood were destined to collide.
Yeah.
But before we dive into the movies, let's talk more about the race itself. You mentioned earlier that the Cannonball attracted a diverse mix of participants.
Mm-hmm.
Who were some of the most notable characters?
Well, you had professional racers like Dan Gurney, who had already made a name for himself in Formula One and endurance racing. He brought a level of legitimacy and prestige to the event. Then you had guys like Steve McQueen. Yes, that's Steve McQueen, who wanted to participate but had to back out because of contractual obligations.
Hold on. The king of cool himself almost raced in the Cannonball Run. That would have been legendary.
It would have been. But even without McQueen, the Cannonball had no shortage of colorful characters. You had teams of doctors, lawyers, businessmen. It was a true cross-section of American society, all united by a love of speed and a sense of adventure.
It sounds like it was as much about the personalities as it was about the race itself.
Absolutely. The camaraderie among the participants was one of the most remarkable aspects of the Cannonball. Sure, they were competing against each other, but there was also a sense of shared purpose, a bond forged by pushing the limits and defying convention.
I bet there were some incredible stories that came out of those races, both on and off the track.
Oh, countless stories. Tales of close calls with the police, ingenious disguises, and acts of kindness between competitors, for example. There was one team that blew a tire in the middle of nowhere. Another team, who were their rivals, stopped to help them change it, even though it meant losing precious time.
That's amazing. So it wasn't just about winning at all costs.
No, it was about something more than that. It was about testing your own limits, about the thrill of the chase, and about the camaraderie that comes from shared experiences, especially when those experiences involved breaking the law and driving across the country at breakneck speeds.
Speaking of breaking the law, how did they manage to stay ahead of the police? Didn't they get pulled over constantly?
Some did, of course, but many of them developed incredibly sophisticated tactics for avoiding detection. Remember those CB radios? Well, they weren't just for chatting with teammates. They were listening in on police frequencies, gathering intel on speed traps and roadblocks.
It's like they turned the entire country into their own personal racetrack, with their own set of rules and strategies.
Exactly. And they got really creative with their disguises, too. Some teams would paint their cars to look like delivery vans or even police cars. Remember, this was a time before cell phones and GPS tracking. The police had to rely on old-fashioned methods, like radar guns and visual identification. The Cannonball racers exploited that to their advantage.
Okay, so we've talked about the rebellious spirit, the colorful characters, and the cat-and-mouse game with the police. But at its core, the Cannonball Run was still a race. What can you tell us about the actual competition, the cars, and the strategies involved?
The cars themselves were a fascinating reflection of the era and the diverse personalities involved. You had everything from high-powered sports cars like Ferraris and Porsches to tricked-out muscle cars, vans, and even, as we've discussed, a souped-up ambulance. There wasn't a specific type of car that guaranteed success. It was more about the driver's skill, the team strategy, and a little bit of luck.
So it wasn't just about raw horsepower.
No, not at all. Reliability was just as important as speed. A breakdown in the middle of nowhere could cost you the race, no matter how fast your car was. Teams had to choose vehicles that could withstand the punishment of high speeds and long distances without falling apart.
That makes sense. You wouldn't want your engine to blow up in the middle of the Nevada desert.
Exactly. And remember, fuel efficiency was also a factor, especially during the fuel crisis of the 1970s. Some teams opted for smaller, more fuel-efficient cars, while others installed auxiliary fuel tanks to minimize stops.
So it was a delicate balance between speed, reliability, and fuel efficiency.
Yeah.
What about the routes? Did they have to follow a specific path, or could they choose their own way?
There were no set routes, which added another layer of strategy to the race. Teams had to carefully plan their course, taking into account factors like traffic, road conditions, and the likelihood of encountering police. Some teams opted for more direct routes, while others took more scenic back roads to avoid detection.
Sounds like a lot of planning and preparation went into these races.
Well, absolutely. It wasn't just a matter of jumping in your car and hitting the gas. There was meticulous planning involved. From choosing the right vehicle and mapping out the route, to gathering intel on police activity and coordinating with your team, it was like a high-stakes chess match played out on the open road.
It sounds exhilarating and exhausting all at the same time. All this talk of planning and strategy makes me think of the record-breaking runs.
Yes. As the Cannonball gained notoriety, the focus shifted towards breaking records and pushing the limits of what was possible. It became a test of human endurance as much as automotive performance. And of course, no discussion of the Cannonball Run would be complete without mentioning the movies it inspired.
Okay, let's talk Hollywood. The Cannonball Run movies are classic 80s comedies. But how closely did they actually reflect the real-life race? I mean, you had Burt Reynolds driving a souped-up ambulance alongside Dom DeLuise dressed as a priest.
Right. The movies definitely took some creative liberties and amped up the comedic aspects, but they did capture the spirit of the Cannonball Run, the camaraderie, the competition, and the sheer audacity of racing across the country in whatever crazy vehicle you could get your hands on.
So the movies might not have been entirely accurate, but they helped cement the Cannonball Run in popular culture.
Yeah.
Did they influence the real-life race in any way?
Interestingly, yes. The success of the Cannonball Run movie actually led to a resurgence of interest in the real-life event. People started organizing their own unsanctioned cannonball-style races, often with more elaborate rules and even prize money.
So the movie that was inspired by the race ended up inspiring more races. That's a pretty cool legacy.
It is, and the legacy of the Cannonball Run extends far beyond Hollywood.
But what about after 1979, the year of the last official cannonball? Did it all just end there?
Not at all. While the organized races may have ceased, the spirit of the Cannonball Run lived on, and it continues to this day, in fact. There have been numerous attempts to break the original cannonball records, using increasingly sophisticated technology and strategies.
Oh, I definitely want to hear about those. Those modern-day cannonball runs sound like they'd be a fascinating blend of old-school grit and cutting-edge tech.
They absolutely are. It's a testament to the enduring legacy of the Cannonball Run.
Well, before we get into the modern era of cannonballing, let's rewind just a bit. We've talked a lot about the crazy tactics and disguises that drivers use to avoid the police. But were there ever any serious consequences for getting caught?
There were definitely risks involved. Getting caught could mean hefty fines, having your car impounded, and even jail time in some cases. But for the most part, the police seemed more amused than angered by the whole thing.
Really? You'd think they'd be cracking down hard on a bunch of people blatantly breaking the law and speeding across the country?
You'd think so. But there was a certain, let's call it, tolerance for the Cannonball Run, at least in its early years. It helped that many of the participants were well-known and respected figures in the automotive world. And let's be honest, there was a certain romanticism to the whole thing.
It sounds like the police officers were almost fans of the race themselves.
It wouldn't surprise me. Remember, this was a time when the national speed limit was widely seen as overly restrictive, and there was a lot of public sympathy for the cannonballers. Even some law enforcement officials saw it as a harmless, albeit illegal, expression of freedom.
So it sounds like the Cannonball Run benefited from a unique set of circumstances. A rebellious spirit, public sympathy, and maybe even a little bit of law enforcement leniency.
Exactly. It was a product of its time. And it's hard to imagine something like it happening today. But that's what makes it so fascinating. It's a snapshot of a bygone era when the open road held a different kind of allure, and the rules were a little more flexible.
That's a great point. The Cannonball Run really does feel like a time capsule, capturing a moment in American history when the relationship between cars, freedom, and authority was undergoing a profound shift.
You're absolutely right. And speaking of shifting gears, let's finally delve into those modern-day cannonball runs.
Yes. Let's fast forward to the 21st century and see how technology and modern-day daredevils have breathed new life into this legendary race.
All right, so modern-day cannonballing, it's a whole different animal from the 70s. The technology's changed drastically. And with it, the strategies and the level of precision involved.
I can only imagine. Back in the original Cannonball days, they were relying on paper maps and CB radios. What are the modern-day equivalents?
Think GPS navigation, sophisticated routing software, Real-time traffic updates, even laser jammers that can basically make a car invisible to police radar.
Wow, it's gone high-tech. So it sounds less like a free-for-all and more like a meticulously planned,
Yeah.
technologically driven operation.
Exactly. The modern cannonballers are using technology to minimize risk and maximize efficiency. They're calculating routes down to the minute, factoring in traffic patterns, speed limits, even the location of gas stations, to optimize fuel stops.
But the approach has become much more strategic and data-driven.
Absolutely. And the results speak for themselves. In 2006, a team driving a BMW M5 shattered the 1979 Cannonball record, completing the run in just over 31 hours, averaging a speed of 87 miles per hour.
That's insane. To break a record that stood for almost 30 years, that must have taken incredible planning and driving skill.
It did. And that record was broken again in 2013 by a team driving a Mercedes-Benz CL55 AMG who completed the run in a mind-boggling 28 hours and 50 minutes with an average speed of almost 90 miles per hour.
90 mile per hour average.
But what's even more remarkable is that the record was broken yet again in 2019 by a team driving an Audi 8L who finished in a mere 27 hours and 25 minutes. They attributed their success to meticulous planning, a highly modified car, and a bit of luck.
Wow. So the records keep falling. What's driving this continued obsession with the Cannonball run? Is it just about the speed, or is there something more to it?
A sense of freedom and possibility. That's increasingly rare in today's world of traffic jams and GPS navigation.
It's interesting that you mentioned that sense of freedom, because that's something that comes up again and again in the stories of the original Cannonballers. It was as much a statement about personal liberty and a rejection of authority as it was about speed.
Exactly, and I think that resonates with people today, even if they've never even heard of the Cannonball Run. There's a certain romanticism to the idea of hitting the open road, leaving your cares behind, and just driving.
It's like that old saying, it's not the destination, it's the journey.
Exactly. And for the Cannonballers, both past and present, the journey is everything. It's a test of skill, endurance, and ingenuity. Even in a world that's increasingly regulated and controlled, there's still room for a little bit of rebellion, a little bit of adventure, and a whole lot of speed.
Well said. I think that perfectly captures the spirit of the Cannonball Run. It's a story that continues to fascinate and inspire, reminding us that the open road is still out there, waiting to be explored. And that sometimes the best adventures are the ones we create ourselves.
Couldn't have said it better myself. From the origins of the Cannonball Run to its modern-day incarnations. And I hope we've given you a taste of what made this race so legendary.